Hello, my name is Preston Singletary and welcome to my presentation. I am a Seattle resident and I grew up here and have lived here ever since. Continue to work and live here in Seattle. But I am a Tlingit tribal member from the Kagwantan clan, which is from the southeast of Alaska, in Sitka. We're said to be, my family is said to be a descendant of Katlian, who was a chief or leader in the Sitka area at the turn of the century. This is my great-grandmother in the center here, who was married just in the early 1900s to a man named George Bartlett, and her name was Susie Johnson Bartlett Gubatayo. So they were married and had children, but my great-grandfather was killed in a sawmill accident in 1919, and she ended up marrying this man, Dionisio Gubatayo, who was a Filipino man who had traveled around the world and ended up in Alaska for the fishing in the canneries. And they had more children and resided in the Seattle area till her death in 1980, and she was at least 100 years old at that time. And this is my son, who is now actually 20 years old, but this kind of shows some of the symbolism and the clothing that we wear in ceremonial moments to signify where we come from within the tribe, clan symbols and such. This is my great aunt and uncle, who were the children of Susie and Dionisio Gubatayo, and they are half Filipino and half Tlingit. And my grandmother actually was full-blooded Tlingit, but she also in turn married a Filipino man. So technically, I'm a Tlingipino. And this is my father. So to mix it up even more, he's European descent, and this is him doing what he loves best, fishing. And but I always knew my father as a creative man and a great outdoorsman. Did a lot of mountain climbing and rock climbing and skiing, and always dabbling in different kinds of things like oil painting and soapstone carving and writing poetry and reading a lot. So my mother as well, both of them played music. They played Delta blues and sang folk songs and things around me when I was a young kid. And but she was also involved with a lot of handicrafts, crocheting and macrame and sewing and all kinds of things, cooking. And so I always cite them as growing up around them, I felt like I didn't really have to limit myself to any one thing. And so I've always been dabbling in lots of different activities. This is my wife, Åsa Sandlund, and we met in Sweden in 1993. And we were married in 1995 in Seattle, and raised our two kids in Seattle. Growing up, my only aspiration was to play music. I wanted to become a professional musician, and dabbled in playing in different bands over the years, and that was something that really kind of fueled my creativity as well, and I'll talk more about that later with my most current band. But so I grew up with this guy, Dante Marioni, and here we are pictured with Lino Tagliapietra. We're up at the Pilchuck school working with him, and developed a really close friendship with Lino, and he taught us a lot about Italian approaches to glass blowing, which really, Lino's traveled the world and taught many, many people, and we've all benefited greatly from being able or having worked with him. And glass blowing is about teamwork, and so I found that this was something. I didn't go to school after high school. I didn't go to college, so I fell right into glass blowing. But at that time, there wasn't a lot of people doing it. And this was in the early '80s, and so I found myself in this with this opportunity, working with lots of great artists and just training through practical experience and working with people. So eventually I figured out how to conjoin my skills with glass blowing and glass making with my Tlingit tribal style. And for me, I always like to say that it awakened this genetic memory that I keep tapping into. And so a little bit of discussion about the objects that I make that are inspired by traditional forms. And so this was a hat that was typically made out of spruce root and woven, and then I made it as a glass bowl, an object, and started to carve these designs into the glass, and then at some point discovered that there was this shadow effect that was really kind of interesting and special, and for me it's become sort of like a spirit within the piece that is revealed when the lighting is just right. So these shadows kind of in my mind kind of have a spiritual quality to them, and so over the years, as my skills have evolved, I'm looking at traditional objects and trying to mimic them in glass and do the traditional carvings and kinds of objects that were made for use. And these are some canoe paddles. So this is my version of a canoe paddle in full scale. This is a full-sized canoe paddle. It has a carving into it. Masks were a really important component of the cultural objects and were used for storytelling. And so and killer whale happens to be my crest symbol. So this is a killer whale ancestral mask, and so this is where I'm looking for inspiration in the kinds of objects I was making, or I've been making over the years. And this is a helmet, actually a war helmet, and so this is kind of my interpretation of a form like that. This is based on a wolf helmet. And then the rattles are also used for ceremonial purposes, and these are some of the most finely carved pieces that exist on the Northwest Coast. And so making that shape for me has always been a real challenge, and trying to bring those traditional kinds of details into the glass sculpture. More examples of rattles, and this is a real scatter shot of, like, as my skills have evolved over the years, what I'm able to achieve in the form of sculpting, freehand sculpting, and some cases using a mold to get some details into the piece. This is a soul catcher. This is a shaman's amulet, and this is my version of a soul catcher. And yeah, to me, this kind of also references the spirituality of the Tlingit community. This was used as a healing implement by a shaman. And this is David Svensson, who became sort of my first mentor. We met at the Pilchuck Glass School and developed a friendship in the late 90s and the late 80s actually. And then by 2000, or just before in around 2000, we talked to the Pilchuck Glass School, where we met about making a totem pole for the school that would tell the story of the origins of the school. And so this was to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the school being in existence. And so David worked on this totem pole up in Haines, Alaska, at the Alaska Indian Arts Studio in Haines, Alaska. And so we carved it mostly up in Haines and then sent it down to the school, where we continued working on it as a class. And so we had several tribal members from different tribes around the country involved. And then we had the carvers from Alaska come down to the school and work with us on finishing the piece. And this is my one contribution to that particular object. This totem pole is a hat that was going to be on the top of the pole. And so this is Dale Chihuly. That's how we represented him with this, sort of glass insert in place of an eye patch. And this is a wolf Shakiet. This was in honor of John Hauberg, who was one of the founders of the school. He repatriated this ceremonial dagger to a family up in Angoon. So John was a passionate Northwest Coast art collector, and his collection resides at the Seattle Art Museum. This one piece, he couldn't determine the provenance of it, so he did some research and repatriated it to the Jacob family in Angoon, and as a result was given a Tlingit name, Gooch Kiates, which means dark wolf. So after about 3 weeks, working on this pole and making some glass elements that were going to be inlaid into the pole, we had the elders from Klukwan, which is a village outside of Haines, to come and officiate the installation ceremony. So as a school, we all came together and carried the totem pole from its workstation by the glass shop here. This was an amazing event for me, because it was almost like a rite of passage, having the glass studio there and working with glass and introducing other Native people to the process of glass making, and then working on the totem pole there next to the hot shop. Here we're putting the hat on top of the totem pole. Little out of sequence slide here. This was supposed to be the first one. But anyway, here's the totem pole in its completion. And the top figure is Annie Hauberg, who was John's wife at the time, and she was the other patron of the school. The two of them and Dale Chihuly are featured here on the totem pole. So this is, since David Svensson is a neon artist as well, he He brought some neon details into the totem pole, and we're illuminating these glass components with neon to emulate sort of abalone effect, the way that kind of catches the iridescence, or the northern lights of Alaska. So during this time of COVID, I'm starting to share with people some thoughts that I have about what kind of brought me to do what I do today. I wasn't raised with any religious instruction, and so but I did read these books, the Carlos Castaneda books, in high school, which was a big trendy thing to do, and it kind of sparked my imagination towards the supernatural and spiritual things, even though a lot of his writings were sort of fabricated to some degree. But there is something in those books that were quite interesting, like the whole idea of navigating within your dream time, and if while you were sleeping, if you could identify your hand and look at your hand and start to look at the periphery beyond your hand, that you'd be able to navigate in your dream time. And I thought that was really fascinating. It led me to read a little bit about Jung's psychology, because he was one of the pioneers of dream analysis, and was really fascinated with the Native American vision quest. And so this is all stuff that kind of feeds into my idea of spirituality. Also, Aikido was a martial art that I'd trained with for several years, and there's a lot of Buddhist philosophy in that activity, and it's sort of very interesting, sort of physical meditation, a moving meditation. And so these are things that are all kind of a confluence of influences for me, things that I think about all the time and inform my work to some degree. And of course there's Joseph Campbell, who did a lot of comparative mythology, which is also a huge inspiration for me. And then Joe David here is a guy that I met in the summer of 2000, and we were up at the Pilchuck Glass School. I was helping him learn about the process of glass blowing, and he basically introduced me to the sweat lodge ceremony. This was an activity that we did on the campus up at Pilchuck, and this was kind of my first introduction to native spirituality, which for me I felt like I was ripe for, and it did give me a lot of inspiration, and constituted in a lot of personal growth, I believe. And my connection with Joe, he helped me a lot understand the culture and the art form. So he's a respected elder and carver from the Nuchanuth tribe, and that's from the west coast of Vancouver Island. And at the end of the session, he, after 4 sweats, which are like 4 or 5 hour ceremonies, he adopted me, and he shared his name with me, and he bestowed that name upon me, which is interesting because in the context of Northwest Coast culture, you can receive different names throughout your lifetime, which would signify a change or a shift in your life. And so that's what that meant for me. A piece that Joe made, this is a wolf skull, And so for me, this really this gave me a lot of power and momentum because of how he, kind of brought me into the fold. And so this was a piece that I made called Teacher and Apprentice, and it was talking about the namesake, Kakao Sheath, which is a transforming killer whale. So that is one of my mentors. And the next guy that I wanted to talk about was Walter Porter, who was a man from Yakutat, and we met in 2004 at the opening of the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., where huge numbers of, hundreds of thousands of indigenous people from North America came to that event. And I met Walter then, and he had seen my work, and he was really fascinated with my idea of working with raven, the raven imagery with the sun in its beak. And I talked to him about this idea. Eventually, this was 10 years later, but I wanted to make an exhibition and work with Walter. Unfortunately, he passed away before we had time to actually realize this exhibition together. And so I turned to another curator and another Tlingit and Zuni woman named Miranda Belardi Lewis, and I asked her to help me curate this exhibition, which originated at the Museum of Glass and is currently at the Wichita Art Museum, and will go to the Smithsonian eventually, as well as the Chrysler Museum in Norfolk, Virginia. So in any case, this is a story of Raven and the Box of Daylight. And this was Raven in the beginning of time when the world was in darkness, and Raven at that time was a white bird. And he goes to the fisherman of the night and he asks, "Where is the daylight?" And so I'm showing you the chronology of how you would experience this exhibition. And he's told of an old man who lives at the head of the Nass River who has the daylight in his clan house. And he's told of the old man's daughter who lives with him. And it just so happens that part of the story, the woman or the young daughter is transparent. And so that signifies a supernatural being, in the same way that the white raven also signifies a supernatural animal. So he goes to the old man and asks to come and see his treasures, and the old man denies him access to the house. And so Raven devises this plan. He transforms himself into a speck of dirt, and when the daughter goes out in the morning to drink water from this stream, she is with her attendants, and the attendants decide to check the purity of the water, and they run a feather through the water, and they discover this dirt, and so they cast out the water. So Raven goes back and reformulates his plan, and this time he decides to transform himself into a hemlock needle. So this mobile is sort of spinning, moving, very gently in this room. And so this is Raven deconstructing himself and turning into this little hemlock needle. He floats down the river, or this stream, and this time when the daughter scoops up the water, they don't see it, and she swallows the water and also swallows the hemlock needle. Well, this is actually Raven now who is inside her, and she realizes that she had swallowed something, and so she becomes pregnant. And so part of the details of the story is that she's, so first of all, she has no husband, but nobody really seems to question that. But she becomes pregnant, and it comes time to give birth. And in the old days, what they would do is dig a little pit out and back behind the clan house, and they would line it with furs, and then the baby would be born on these furs. And she's having trouble giving birth, and so a medicine woman comes by and says, "Oh, you should change it to moss. Take the furs out. The baby doesn't want to be born on these furs." So they put moss out into this little pit, and then the child is born. So this is Raven inside of her, sort of transforming into a human child. And then this, when she finally does give birth, she gives birth to Raven in the form of a human child. And so this is illustrating kind of the transformation of Raven, transforming into a human. And this is also animated with kind of motion and lights, or like a image that's projected onto this little hat form. And so this is how Raven eventually gets into the clan house. So this is the old man kind of presiding over his treasures, his precious objects, and so the child grows really quickly, and the old man is really excited to have a grandchild, but he's very precocious and very mischievous, and he's always poking around looking for things, and he comes across these boxes, and one by one, he's playing with this first box, and it's the box that contains the stars, and when no one's looking, he opens up the box and he tosses the stars into the sky, where they remain today. Each time. So a couple days later, he finds the next box. It's the box that contains the moon, and he's told, don't open the box by the grandfather. But so he kind of bides his time, and finally he does open the box, and he takes the moon, and he tosses it through the smoke hole in the clan house, and it ends up in the sky again, in the black sky. And so this time, the old man's pretty, disappointed, and scolds him. And so when the child finds the third box, the old man's like, okay, don't open the box, and so the child starts to cry and wail, and he stops eating, he becomes weak, and he's pretty much driving everybody crazy at this point. And then the daughter goes to the father and says, is there anything that's more important than your grandson? And the old man realizes, of course, she's right, and so he lets the child play with the third box that contains the sun. And maybe knowing what was going to happen, but not really happy about it. So the child finally opens up the box and decides to transform himself back into a bird. And the old man realizes that he's been fooled, and he grabs the raven by its tail, and he's flapping away, trying to get away, and he directs him over the fire in the central the central fire pit in the clan house, and the soot from the flames is what turns Raven black, and so that's how Raven became a black bird. And so he flies through the smoke hole in the clan house. He breaks daylight on the world, and the people in the world, some of them, were startled, and they jumped up into the air, and they became the birds. Some of them ran off into the forest, and they became the forest animals. And then some of them jumped into the water, and they became the sea life. and the people that remained where they are today became the human beings or the Tlingit people. And so that's how one theory of how these animals were eventually adopted into clan symbols and representing different families. And a little bit about modernism, which is another kind of inspiration for me. I was since I didn't go to art school, I was left to kind of research and learn about art on my own, and something about the surrealist again with the that came up, and I read things about them that they held Northwest Coast art in high regard because it was kind of, you know, abstractions and symbolisms and things like this, and so it caused me to look at modernism in different ways. And there was a writer, native writer named Renard Strickland who said he wrote that it's ironic that the modernists forced us to look at the primitive and appreciate differing levels of reality. And because the modernists were so enamored with art from these old cultures, you know, such as oceanic cultures, native cultures, and African cultures, they were looking at this for inspiration. And in some cases, you can kind of see how it was quite, you know, almost, you know, appropriated in some cases. The Picassos and these African helmets, then so I started to look at those kinds of things and try to become inspired by them. Now, this is a Brancusi, and this was my, you know, little take at kind of turning the tables on the modernists and using their work as inspiration to create abstractions within the context of my work. And then, so this is a eagle raven. You know, if you look at the top edge or top side of that sculpture, it's the eagle beak, and if you look at, you know, the bottom side, that's kind of the raven side. So there's a duality there. This is the origin of mosquitoes. This is how this man here had to stalk this cannibal giant, and because it was taking young children and from the villages, and so he stalks it. He decides he's going to kill it and rid the community of this monster, and he decided that he was really going to do away with it, and so he burned the carcass of this beast after he killed it. But then the embers off the body, they transformed into mosquitoes, and they're still trying to eat us today. This is, I call this hyacinth medicine amulet. This was in honor again of like Joe David, whose middle name is Hyacinth, so playing with some these spare, simple forms, or these more organic forms, and then ornamenting it with Northwest Coast art, in my mind was kind of being inspired by the modernist sensibility. This is a mussel shell, and this is a little bit like a Brancusi form that I was inspired by. Had this hole in it and this little print that was kind of protruding out of it, and then kind of playing with different sculptural forms that sometimes in Northwest Coast print you might see only certain elements that are kind of in the design that notate a fin or a pectoral fin or the head or the tail or whatever. So this was my way of kind of playing with that abstraction of the two-dimensional design in a three-dimensional form. This is called Volcano Woman. And then this one is really just like a very inspired by kind of a rattle form, but again, just playing with these elements of design which really make it Northwest Coast art, how these elements work together in a very kind of puzzle-like fashion. These are some of the monumental works that I've done. This is one of the first big pieces I did for the Seattle Art Museum. This was called Keet Shagun, which was a killer whale screen, and this was about 7 by 5 feet tall, and is based on a heraldic screen that would be within the interior of a clan house. And then this was a commission that I was given for a cultural arts center in Alaska, sort of my home community. These forms were based on house posts, which were, decorative carvings that would ornament and cover up these support beams within the clan house. This is the final installation, which kind of resembles the interior of a clan house. And this is a gathering space in this cultural arts center where a lot of storytelling and meetings and gatherings happen. This was a piece called Symbolic Wealth. This is based on a Tana piece or a copper, which denotes the high status of an individual. This is that piece that's installed into a private home, which is backlit with lights that can be brightened or dimmed. Again, the canoe paddles, kind of working with more larger kiln cast forms, and all of these pieces are actually kiln formed rather than blown, which is typical of my work. And then sometimes I have to go back to Dave's coffee shop to work on larger pieces. This was a full-scale totem that I designed and David carved for me in wood. Since I'm not a wood carver, I work collaboratively with carvers to make these pieces. And I commissioned him and designed and worked on this piece, which represents my great-grandmother, and she had a pet grizzly bear as a child. And so this is the grizzly bear. It's telling a story, which is by tradition what totem poles actually do. They're supposed to tell a story. And so this is the story of my great-grandmother, and this is how this was cast in solid glass. It weighs about 2,000 pounds, and it was made in the Czech Republic. So I work with the artists in the Czech Republic because they're well versed at making these large castings, which are very, very and it's the point at which the art ends and the science kind of begins, as far as melting this much glass and making it solid and there's the cooling process on such a large piece is very, very tricky, because if it's cooled too fast, it will fracture and break. And so these guys have a lot of experience doing this kind of thing. So here we're installing a couple of the sections onto that, into this home. And there's the top section with the grizzly bear cub, and here it is kind of in not completely finished, but we're nearly done with the installation process. And this was the second large-scale totem that I've been working on. This is a plastic model, as you can see, but this is the finished piece. This is something that is this piece is actually 2,800 pounds of glass, and this one's just newly completed. And this is my team that works with me, has been working with me for close to 15 years, helping me make all of my work, every aspect of it. This is my studio a few years back before it got cluttered with more and more stuff. But so these are the folks that help me. This is some of the ways that I get the designs into the glass. This is a rubber stencil that is put onto the surface, and then I'll draw the designs onto the stencil, and then I'll have my assistant here, Brittany, cut out the stencil and expose the areas that will be carved. And this is Terry. She's doing a kind of elaborate process that creates the ability to carve this texture into the glass and make it look like basketry. So this is Maurice, is an old friend of mine that I've worked with for many, many years and played music with, and all kinds of art projects together. And so back to the music. This is a group that I had called Little Big Band about a little over 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And I wanted to blend native culture with contemporary music, or actually funk jazz music, funk rock styles. And so I brought some of my tribal members together for doing some performance art and spoken word storytelling and that type of thing, blended with the music. And so this was one group that I ran for several years. This is Swilcanum, it's the Lummi tribal member. And then the great James Luna, who passed away, but he brought a lot of flavor to the group at that time, and we did a lot of fun kind of performance art components to the group. But then about 2013, I met this guy, Bernie Worrell, who was the co-founder of Parliament Funkadelic, and so he was the keyboard player and band director for that group. And he and I met in the summer of 2013 when I turned 50 years old, and I told him about my band, and so he came out to play. I paid into a Kickstarter campaign, and he came out and played my 50th birthday party. And so I made his acquaintance then, and I showed him my studio, showed him my work, and then my band, Little Big Band, got to open up for his band, the Bernie Worrell Orchestra, and so we became friends. And as we were parting ways after this performance, we did one night we did a party, and the next night we did he performed with his group. But as in parting ways, he said, I've been thinking about your work or your music, and we need to get together and work on some music together. And so I was pretty blown away that he had an interest in working with me. So I took him up on that, and by December of 2013, we came together and we started recording music for a period of about 3 years, actually, till he died in 2016. But so we came up with several multi-disc LPs, and each time we were sort of working with, again, storytelling and taking that to new levels, also working with language preservation and composing songs in Tlingit, Haida, and Yupik on the most recent album coming up. Actually, we have a fourth album, triple LP this time, and this one here was called Heen, which means water in the Tlingit language, so that's what unifies the album. All the songs have references to water, which was very poignant and timely because that was the time of the Dakota Pipeline protests, and so we did some politically outspoken pieces for this particular album. But so it is to say that we just had an amazing time working with Bernie in the studio. It resulted in all this music. This is Skerrick. He's a good friend of mine from Seattle, very avant-garde saxophone player and composer, artist in his own right. And Stanton Moore, who's a funk jazz drummer from New Orleans, came up and played on the first 2 albums. Captain Rob is a Blackfoot tribal member. Clarissa Rizal, who was another very important mentor to me, who passed away in 2016, same year as Bernie. We lost 2 members at that time in that year, and so that was pretty devastating. But we persevere. We've got a new keyboard player. We've got a new drummer because Stanton can't be in the Seattle area all the time. So we have figured out a way to keep the band going in a new direction. This is our 4th and final album that will be coming out hopefully after the first of the year. And so that's it. I hope you all enjoyed the presentation, and here's our ways to keep tabs on the work that I'm doing and find out more about the music or anything that you might want to know. So anyway, thanks for tuning in, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks.